Hi, these are the most interesting historical photos that I could find. Let's go! Robert Wadlow towers over another man at his high school graduation in 1936, a real image of the height that later made him the tallest man in recorded history. He reached 8 feet 11 inches tall. Long Beach in 1944 was so crowded with oil derricks that the coast looked almost unrecognizable. In the 1940s, drilling spread across large parts of the city, and towers like these stood across neighborhoods and shoreline land. Over Berlin on May 19, 1944, a camera caught the split second before the flying fortress. Miss Donna May, too, was struck by a bomb dropped from an aircraft above it. All 11 crew members were lost that day. 3 days after September 11, 2001, the Pentagon still showed a massive broken section on its outer ring. American Airlines Flight 77 struck the building, and 189 people lost their lives. A German Dornier. Do-17 ended its 1940 mission inside a row of English homes, creating one of the most surreal Battle of Britain images ever captured. The Do-17 was nicknamed the Flying Pencil because of its long, narrow fuselage. In 1934, British driver Raymond Mays lost a wheel during the Carefully Hill climb in Cardiff, yet his Bugatti Type 13 somehow stayed upright. The car stopped only inches from the edge of the drop. Workers fit a massive new propeller to the liner Leviathan on February 24, 1929, and the blades look almost unreal beside the men on the platform. The Leviathan was over 950 feet long and was one of the largest passenger liners of its time. Japanese troops pose on a Chinese Curtiss Hawk after taking the race course in eastern Shanghai, where the fighter had come down in 1937. The aircraft came down on August 16, 1937, and was seized on September 13, 1937, when Japanese forces took the Yingang race course. In 1949, a Japanese National Railways train ran into a building during one of the strangest 6-week periods in rail history. That summer became known as the 3 Great Mysteries of Japanese National Railways after the Shimoyama case, the Mitaka incident. Marilyn Monroe laughs with Groucho Marx in 1949, just before her rise turned her into one of Hollywood's biggest stars. Love Happy was released in 1949, and Monroe had only a small part in the film. A Soviet partisan in 1943 poses with a PPSH-41, a pistol, several grenades, and extra gear packed across his coat. Partisan units like this operated behind German lines across Belarus, Ukraine, and Western Russia in 1943. Residents of Moscow gather outside a loudspeaker in June 1941 as the city hears that Germany had attacked the Soviet Union. Operation Barbarossa began on June 22, 1941, and opened the largest land campaign in history. Moscow's White House burns in October 1993 during Russia's constitutional crisis. On October 4th, tanks fired at the Parliament building while lawmakers were still inside. In France in 1944, an American medic treats a wounded German soldier on the roadside, capturing a rare moment of mercy in the middle of war. By 1944, the laws of war required wounded enemy soldiers to receive medical care when possible. Taken in 1901, this portrait shows Theodore Roosevelt at the moment he suddenly entered the White House after President William McKinley's death. Roosevelt was 42 in 1901 and remains the youngest person ever to become President of the United States. A MAZ 7310 truck carries a giant liquid hydrogen tank at Baikonur in the 1960s, and the load looks almost bigger than the road. The MAZ was an 8-wheel heavy truck, and Baikonur was the main launch site of the Soviet space program. In 1910, the Great Flood of Paris turned streets into canals and sent library books floating through the city. The Seine rose to 8.62 meters above normal, and tens of thousands of homes lost gas or electricity. Sergei Eisenstein studies film strips at his editing table in the 1920s, shaping the fast cutting style that changed cinema. By 1925, he had made battleship Potemkin and became one of the key pioneers of montage editing. On November 7, 1940, Howard Clifford runs for safety on the Tacoma Narrows Bridge as the road bends into wild waves. The bridge had opened in July 1940 and fell apart just 4 months later after strong wind pushed it past its limit. An Austro-Hungarian artillery piece is dragged across the Ortler Massif at a slope that looks almost unreal. The position stood about 3,850 meters above sea level, and about 50 men were needed to haul the gun there. Robin Williams and Whoopi Goldberg testified before a Senate committee in 1990, turning a hearing on homelessness into a major public moment. They spoke in support of the Homelessness Prevention and Community Revitalization Act of 1990. In 1955, New York put a giant wire basket of trash in Times Square so people could see how much litter they were leaving behind. The sign claimed Times Square alone missed the litter basket with 1,200 pounds of trash a day. A black man and a white man lead a civil rights march behind a sign that reads "Black and White Together," turning the street into a direct challenge to segregation. In 1931, an ironworker sits high above Manhattan on the unfinished Empire State Building, with the city far below him. The building opened in 1931, rose 1,250 feet to its roof, and was completed in just 410 days. Werner von Braun sits in his United States office with a line of rocket models that ends in the Saturn V. He later became a leading figure of Apollo, but in the 1940s he had directed V-2 rocket work tied to the Mittelwerk underground factory. During Prohibition, United States agents inspected industrial alcohol that had been made toxic, so bootleggers could not turn it into illegal liquor. From 1920 to 1933, toxic alcohol killed more than 10,000 people in the United States. In 1949, reservist Edward T. Atkins built this tiny veteran service car from surplus aircraft parts, giving it a cockpit look straight out of the war years. It had a key cutting machine on the side and a lathe built into the dashboard. In 1915, a mule hauls a cart of rubble through a subway tunnel being cut under Central Park at 7th Avenue and 60th Street. This excavation later became part of the route used by New York trains, now known as the N&R. In 1959, Liberace leaves court smiling as his libel case against the Daily Mirror begins in London. He sued writer William Connor and won the case later that year. Hungary advertised this refrigerator in 1969 with fashion models instead of engineers, turning a kitchen appliance into a full studio spectacle. The ad includes an open fridge, a soda siphon, and 2 fur coats, details that match the consumer style of late 1960s Eastern Europe. Johnny Eck and his twin brother Robert posed together in the 1920s, years before Eck became one of the most recognizable performers in America. Born in 1911, Eck later appeared in the 1932 film Freaks. Benito Mussolini stands with German troops after his dramatic rescue from the Mountain Hotel at Gran Sasso on September 12, 1943. He had been held there after his fall from power, and German forces flew him out by light aircraft the same day. Nellie Bly stands beside an Austrian army officer in Poland in December 1914, showing the famous investigative reporter far from the newsroom during World War I. Bly had already become world famous for exposing asylum abuse. Douglas and Elizabeth Hearn pose with their 8 children beside their caravan after returning to a traveling life in Wales. The family had lived in a house for 6 years before setting out from Bala toward Swansea. American soldiers move across Okinawa in April 1945, captured low to the ground in one of the most intense Pacific Island campaigns. The Okinawa campaign lasted from April to June 1945, and more than 180,000 United States troops took part. A man shows his children abandoned Pakistani tanks after the Battle of Asal Uttar in 1965, a quiet scene left behind by a major armored clash. The battle took place in Punjab in September 1965, and large numbers of Pakistani tanks were left on the field. In 1999, Russian opposition protesters filled the street, demanding Boris Yeltsin's resignation as communist and National Bolshevik symbols rose above the crowd. Yeltsin left office on December 31, 1999, ending one of the most chaotic decades in modern Russian history. In 1900, Russia's Emperor Nicholas II is photographed recovering from typhoid fever, seated in a wheelchair beside his bed. His rule ended in 1917 when the Romanov dynasty collapsed. Annie Jones appears in an elegant dress with 3 striking bows, a polished portrait of one of the most famous bearded performers of the 1800s. Born in 1865, she later pushed Barnum and Bailey to drop the word freak from its advertising and died in 1902 at age 37. Female Contra members pose in Nueva Guinea in 1987, a rare image of women inside Nicaragua's anti-Sandinista movement. The Contra conflict shaped Nicaragua through the 1980s. Ulysses S. Grant sits beside President Andrew Johnson in June 1865, a rare image of the 2 men who stood at the center of the United States just after the Civil War ended. Johnson became president in April 1865 after Abraham Lincoln's death. Shanghai Mayor Jiang Zemin faces 3,000 students in December 1986, turning a tense protest moment into a 5-hour public showdown. He spoke at Shanghai University of Science and Technology during the 1986 student protests in Shanghai. Mexican women arrived near La Pryor, Texas in 1939 for another day of spinach picking, with baskets stacked in the truck behind them. The photo was taken by Russell Lee during the Great Depression, when South Texas farms relied on migrant labor. Before Rocky changed his life, Sylvester Stallone was so broke in the 1970s that he sold his dog Butkus for $40. After getting Rocky made, he bought Butkus back for $15,000 and gave him a role in the film. At his 1936 high school graduation, the man on the left looks almost unreal beside the person next to him. He later reached 8 feet 11 inches and remains the tallest feet 11 inches and remains the tallest person in recorded history. A 1925 office Christmas party packed dozens of workers around a thin tree, turning an ordinary workplace into a rare group portrait of the Jazz Age. The wooden desks, formal suits, and bobbed hairstyles fixed the scene firmly in mid-1920s office life. Veronica Foster became one of the most recognizable women in wartime Canada after posing as Ronnie, the Bren Gun Girl, in the 1940s. She also served in the Canadian Women's Army Corps. An American soldier keeps a small photo inside the grip of his M1911, turning a standard Army pistol into something deeply personal. In the 1940s, some soldiers placed family or partner photos under clear grip panels, so the image stayed with them in the field. Sylvia Hardy stands between 2 smaller figures in a portrait that makes her height look almost unreal. Born in Maine in 1824, she later toured the United States, Cuba, and parts of Europe after joining Barnum's show in her 30s. Captured at Yantan Airfield in April 1945, this Yokosuka MXY-7 Oka looks small on the ground, but it was one of the most extreme aircraft of World War II. The Model 11 was a piloted attack craft carried under a bomber. In 1900, a family stands proudly before their new home with 2 horses, turning a private milestone into a rare full household portrait. The horses, picket fence, and wide front porch capture everyday family life at the start of the 1900s. Young laborers from Crete pose at the Knossos, dig in 1902, one of the earliest images from the excavation that changed what the world knew about Bronze Age Europe. Sir Arthur Evans began work at Knossos in 1900. Joseph Taborski hugs his mother in Connecticut in 1955 after his death sentence was overturned, in a photo that looked like a final reprieve. A little over 1 year later, he admitted the 1950 murder and 5 more killings, and he was executed in 1960. In 1900, Henry Cyril Paget, the 5th Marquess of Anglesey, posed in a costume that made him look more like a stage star than a British nobleman. He became famous for extravagant outfits and died young after spending a fortune, later estimated at about £43 million. The Mirabal sisters posed together in 1959, a calm photo of women who soon became the most famous faces of resistance in the Dominican Republic. They openly opposed Rafael Trujillo's rule, and their story later became a lasting symbol of courage across Latin America. In 1928, Alfred Lowenstein, one of the richest men in the world, is seen with the plane linked to one of aviation's strangest mysteries. During a flight from Croydon to Brussels, he left his seat, disappeared from the cabin. Alfred Zech looks startlingly young in this portrait, yet the medal on his jacket marks one of the most unusual wartime honors of his era. Born in 1932, he received the Iron Cross Second Class at age 12 and became the youngest known recipient of the award. Spring break in 1979 looked like sun, palm trees, bare skin, and an old American car parked right in the middle of the scene. The low-rise jeans, bikini, and worn 1950s sedan lock the image firmly into late 1970s beach culture. Luther Burbank stands in Santa Rosa in 1926, already famous as one of the most influential plant breeders in the United States. He developed the Burbank potato and hundreds of other new plant varieties before dying that year at age 77. Billy the Kid stands in one of the only known photos of the outlaw who became one of the most famous figures of the American West. He was convicted in New Mexico on April 13, 1881, and died 3 months later at age 21. Siegfried Müller was a former German soldier who became one of the most notorious mercenary commanders during the Congo crisis in the 1960s. He was accused of serious abuses in Congo and was never convicted. A B-17 Flying Fortress returns with its nose torn open, showing how much damage these bombers could survive in the air. It came back to England despite major damage to the front of the aircraft. Kurt Gödel was one of the most important mathematicians of the 1900s, and his work changed logic in a way that still shapes modern science. In 1977, he was found severely undernourished after refusing most food unless his wife prepared it. Janet Cook was a Washington Post reporter whose Pulitzer-winning story became one of the biggest journalism scandals of the 1980s. On April 13, 1981, she received the prize for a story about an 8-year-old boy who did not exist, and she returned it days later. In 1943, Nazi flags hang over the Deutschland Transatlantic Bank in Argentina, showing how openly the regime's symbols appeared far from Germany. Argentina stayed officially neutral through most of World War II and declared war on Germany only in 1945. Hugh Hefner sent the Playboy jet Big Bunny to help evacuate South Vietnamese children in April 1975, creating one of the strangest images of the war's final weeks. The flight was part of Operation Baby Lift, which moved about 3,300 children out of Vietnam between April 3 and April 26, 1975. Doreen Leoy, a former Tiger Beat editor, stands with Richard Ramirez after turning a prison obsession into one of the strangest celebrity stories of the 1990s. She sent him about 75 letters over 11 years and married him on death row in 1996. John Hinckley Jr. became infamous after attacking President Ronald Reagan in 1981 in an attempt to impress actress Jodie Foster. On March 30, 1981, his attack outside a Washington hotel injured Reagan and 3 other men. Russian soldiers gather around Easter cakes and eggs in a rare World War I photo that feels more like a village holiday than a wartime camp. The image was taken on April 3, 1917, during Easter celebrations in the Russian army. Frank Sinatra, one of the most famous American singers of the 1900s, appears in a rare 1976 photo surrounded by men linked to organized crime. The image was taken on April 11, 1976, at the Westchester Premier Theater. Frank Sinatra, one of the biggest singers in American history, appears in a rare 1976 photo with several men later linked to the Mafia. The picture was taken on April 11, 1976, at the Westchester Premier Theater. Meryl Streep appears here as Daisy May in a 1966 high school production, years before she became one of the most acclaimed actresses in film history. The photo was taken at Bernards High School in Bernardsville, New Jersey, when she was 17. A French soldier with 2 prosthetic arms learns to write again after World War I, a striking image of how survivors had to rebuild life from the smallest movements. World War I left millions of men permanently disabled. Harry S. Truman appears here as a World War I captain, years before he became President of the United States. This photo was taken in 1918, and he later became the 33rd president in 1945. British soldiers rest beside a shattered building at Athens in April 1917, a quiet pause in the middle of a ruined war zone. The photo was taken east of Arras during the spring fighting of 1917. Paula Prince appears in this Chicago Walgreens photo just hours before becoming one of the most haunting faces of the 1982 Tylenol tampering case. She bought extra-strength Tylenol that day, and 7 people in the Chicago area died in the same crisis. Elton John, Howie Long, and Phil Donahue carry the casket of Ryan White, the Indiana teenager who became the most famous public face of the AIDS crisis in America. White died in 1990 at age 18 after getting HIV from a blood transfusion as a child. Richard Chase became one of the most notorious crime figures in California in the late 1970s. He later told investigators that an unlocked door meant he could enter, while a locked door meant he was not welcome. A United States warship deck tilts under a Pacific storm so hard that the aircraft look ready to slide into the sea. On December 17, 1944, Typhoon Cobra struck the fleet, and 3 destroyers were lost in the storm. Women attend a class in Pakistan in the 1960s, a photo that quietly breaks many modern stereotypes about the era. The class was held inside a Pakistan International Airlines building, and the image was taken by Harrison Foreman. A weightlifter fights through his 3rd attempt as boys watch from only a few feet away, turning a small meet into a scene of pure tension. The photo was taken at Energia Stadium in Nurek in 1982, when Tajikistan was still part of the Soviet Union. Stalingrad in 1943 looks almost erased, with whole blocks reduced to ruins after months of battle. The battle ended in February 1943, and the Soviet victory became a major turning point on the Eastern Front. Josie Smith, a retired disabled miner, is led away by police during the 1984 coal strike, turning one street arrest into a stark image of Britain's bitter mining conflict. The photo was taken at Easington Colliery in August 1984 during the year Long Miners' Strike. Sergei Korolev, the engineer who later led the mission that sent the first human into space, appears here in a stark 1940 prison photo. Just 21 years later, on April 12, 1961, his program launched Yuri Gagarin into orbit. A Soviet soldier in Afghanistan rides a donkey, a striking image where modern gear meets one of the oldest ways to travel. Soviet forces were in Afghanistan from 1979 to 1989. Ronald and Nancy Reagan greeted the crew of Columbia after its July 4, 1982 landing. The black nose tiles were part of the heat shield that brought the shuttle back from orbit. Late 1800s portrait of Abdurrahman Khan, the Iron Emir, who forced a divided Afghanistan under one rule. He ruled for 21 years, and his reign is linked to more than 100,000 deaths. February 1861 photo of huge Columbiad cannons guarding the Pensacola Bay coast in Florida. These were some of the largest shore guns of their time and were placed to control ships entering the harbor. George Lincoln Rockwell posed with supporters beside his propaganda bus in Virginia in 1961. He led an extremist movement founded in 1959 and used stunts like this to pull cameras and crowds. American paratroopers moved through Sainte-Marie-du-Mont on June 7, 1944, one day after the Normandy landings. The town stood just inland from Utah Beach and became one of the first routes from the coast into Normandy. Chinese troops took position behind sandbags and a log barrier during the Shanghai fighting of 1932. The clash pulled large armies into the streets of one of the world's biggest cities. Winston Churchill stands beside King Farouk of Egypt in this 1942 photo. Farouk had become king in 1936 and lost the throne in 1952. A man lifts a newspaper in Budapest on October 23, 1989, the day Hungary became a democratic republic. The declaration ended the Hungarian People's Republic and tied the new state to the date of the 1956 uprising. Australian troops closed in on a Japanese pillbox with an M3 Stuart tank at Cape Europa in 1943. The Buna Campaign became one of the first Allied ground victories against Japan in the Southwest Pacific. James Baldwin jokes with Geraldine Page and Rip Torn in New York in 1963. Later that year, Baldwin chose Torn for a meeting with Robert Kennedy, and both were later watched by the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Ella Watson, known as Cattle Kate, was photographed in the 1880s as a rare female homesteader in Wyoming. In 1889, she was falsely accused of cattle theft, killed by ranchers, and her case helped spark the Johnson County War. Anwar Sadat trims his mustache before the workday in this 1970s photo. He became Egypt's president in 1970 and won the 1978 Nobel Peace Prize for the Camp David Accords with Israel. A family heads home in Hiroshima in 1945 after medical treatment, with an injured child riding in a handcart. The city was hit by an atomic bomb on August 6, 1945, and many survivors needed long medical care. Yuri Gagarin reports by phone after landing on April 12, 1961, just after the first human flight into space. Vostok 1 lasted 108 minutes and completed one orbit of Earth. Sailors march in Wilhelmshaven in 1918 during the naval unrest that shook Imperial Germany. The crisis helped start the German Revolution and ended imperial rule that same year. Mohammed V sits with Franklin Roosevelt and Winston Churchill at the Casablanca Conference in 1943. Roosevelt later told the Moroccan ruler he supported independence, and Morocco became independent in 1956. A Polish farmer plows his field with a horse in about 1981, while factory smoke fills the horizon. It shows hand farming still in use as large industrial plants spread across the same landscape. Future President Theodore Roosevelt guards 3 captured boat thieves in North Dakota in 1886. He was 28 and became President of the United States in 1901. Woodrow Wilson and William Howard Taft laugh at the White House on March 4, 1913, just before power changed hands. Taft left office that day, and Wilson became the 28th President of the United States. Veterans of the Abraham Lincoln Brigade march in New York around 1945. They were Americans who fought in Spain against Franco from 1936 to 1938. A formal visit unfolds beneath striped horseshoe arches, and the room looks almost endless behind the men in coats. These arches match the Great Mosque of Cordoba, first begun in 785 and famous for its hall of more than 850 columns. A Korean schoolgirl reaches out to young pioneers in a rare moment that feels almost unreal today. The photo is dated to the 1940s in northern Korea, where young pioneer groups spread after 1945. Dresden looks almost unreal here, with one dark tower still rising above a city turned to ruins. Allied air raids struck the city on February 13th and February 14th, 1945, and much of the historic center was destroyed. A rare private moment catches Britain's former Prime Minister in tears just after he left office. He resigned in 1955 and stayed in Parliament until 1964, but he never became Prime Minister again. Paris in 1968 looks almost unreal here, with students turning Boulevard Saint-Germain into a street of chaos in broad daylight. Bruno Barbet took this photo in May 1968, when protests spread across France and about 10 million workers joined a national strike. Seattle police in Red Cross masks make 1918 look strangely modern, as if the street stepped a century forward. The photo was taken in December 1918 during the influenza outbreak, when face masks became part of daily life in Seattle. A huge flag rises above the Reichstag while Berlin still lies in ruins below, making this one of the most famous images of 1945. The image is linked to Meliton Cantaria, and the flag was raised in Berlin in May 1945, days before Germany surrendered on May 8, 1945. Grace Kelly sits on deck with her parents as she sails toward Monaco, just days before becoming a princess. She left New York in April 1956 and married Prince Rainier of Monaco on April 19, 1956. A Rolls-Royce grill turned into a Wall Street tower made this one of the strangest skyline visions of the 1960s. Hans Hollein created this montage in 1966 as a proposal for a skyscraper in New York. Mounted Soviet troops ride through Mozdok in 1943, turning one muddy street into a rare real-time image of the North Caucasus campaign. Mozdok was retaken in January 1943 during the Soviet winter advance in the Caucasus. A rare early camera frame captures Queen Victoria and Napoleon III side by side, a meeting almost no one could freeze in time back then. It was taken in 1855 during the Crimean War and is widely described as the only known photo of a British and French monarch together. South African armored carmen clean a heavy machine gun beside their vehicle in a rare close view of field maintenance during the East African Campaign. The campaign took place in 1940 and 1941 across Ethiopia, Eritrea, and Somalia. An elegant dancer's portrait hides one of the most debated resistance stories from Auschwitz. Francesca Mann was a Polish performer linked to a 1943 prisoner revolt there, though historians still dispute some details of what happened. American soldiers pose with a swastika flag they captured in 1944, turning a feared symbol into proof that the front was moving the other way. By late 1944, United States forces had broken out from Normandy, crossed France, and were fighting their way toward Germany. Before he became one of America's best-known Europe guides, Rick Steves left home in 1973 with a backpack almost bigger than he was. He started the trip the day after high school with $3 a day and a 10-week Eurail pass. Future President Gerald Ford stands beside Willis Ward in a 1934 Michigan team photo taken before one of the era's most striking team disputes. Ford threatened to leave the team when Ward was barred from the Georgia Tech game because Georgia Tech would not face a black player. A backstage photo from Apollo 13 shows the film set before one of the most famous space dramas reached theaters. The movie opened in 1995 and retold the damaged 1970 moon mission that brought all three astronauts back alive. A Vietnam veteran hugs a woman beside a hand-painted sign, turning the memorial opening into a deeply human moment. The Vietnam Veterans Memorial opened in Washington on November 13, 1982, and Maya Lin designed its black granite wall. A sweet shop doorway turns into a wall of eager children on the day rationing ends in England. Sweet rationing in Britain ended in February 1953, almost 14 years after it began in 1939. A lineup of Los Angeles police officers in dresses looks unbelievable until you learn it was an undercover trap. The photo was taken in 1960 when police used women's clothing as disguise to catch a pickpocket. Paratroopers paint their faces beside a transport plane, creating one of the wildest real images from the road to Normandy. The photo is linked to the Filthy 13, a United States demolition group associated with Choctaw soldier Jake McNeese before the June 1944 invasion. A crowd pours out of Webster Hall, and the street looks packed almost beyond control. Webster Hall opened in Manhattan in 1886 and became one of New York's best-known sites for mass meetings and public events. The Hungarian parliament dominates the Danube in this 1942 view, and its scale still looks unreal. The building opened in 1902 and has 691 rooms under a dome 96 meters high. John Arthur Ackroyd's mugshot is tied to one of the most haunting highway cases in Oregon. He was arrested in 1990, and several young women disappeared along Highway 20 during the 1970s and 1980s. A simple breakfast room became one of the most powerful images of the Black Panther movement, with volunteers feeding children before school. The Free Breakfast for Children program began in 1969. An elderly woman holding a faded portrait turned her own life into a mystery that reached all the way to the Kremlin. Vera Putina was born in 1926, died in 2023, and publicly claimed she was Vladimir Putin's biological mother. Joseph Medicine Crow looks like a quiet graduate here, but this 1938 portrait came before one of the most remarkable lives of the war. Born in 1913, he became the first Crow member to finish college. An ordinary residential school photo can hide one of Canada's darkest hidden programs. About 1,300 Indigenous people, including around 1,000 children, were used in nutrition studies in the 1940s and 1950s. This quiet portrait became linked to one of the most shocking church mysteries in the United States. Sister Margaret Ann Paul, age 71, was found in a locked chapel in 1980, and DNA evidence solved the case 24 years later. One family survived two different American attacks almost 70 years apart, and both times the survivor hid in a closet. Charles H. Cohen survived the 1949 Camden attack at age 12, and his granddaughter Carly Noble survived the 2018 Marjorie Stoneman Douglas School attack the same way. This 1965 mugshot later became one of Ohio's strangest fugitive images because the man in it simply vanished from custody. Lester Eubanks was sentenced in 1966 for the 1965 case of 14-year-old Mary Ellen Diener, avoided execution when Ohio ended the death penalty in 1972. One woman quietly built the largest known private archive of American television by recording the news for 33 years. Marion Stokes began in 1979, kept taping until 2012, and left behind more than 71,000 videotapes. This portrait is linked to one of the strangest real cases in American history, when a former officer fell from the sky during a smuggling run. Andrew Thornton was found dead in Tennessee on September 11, 1985, and a black bear was later found dead after eating part of the cargo he dropped. A 19-year-old deserter in a captain's uniform fooled people into thinking he had real power in 1945. Willie Harold found a Luftwaffe officer's uniform, took control at Emsland, was linked to the deaths of more than 100 prisoners, and was executed in 1946. Klaus Kinski stands in front of one of cinema's most unreal production shots with a ship sitting on a hill behind him. Werner Herzog released Fitzcarraldo in 1982 and had a real steamship hauled over a hill in Peru for the film. Marvin Gaye smiles here just before one of music's most tragic final chapters. He died on April 1, 1984, one day before his 45th birthday, at his family home in Los Angeles. Violet Charlesworth fooled people into believing she was a rich heiress and turned that lie into a glamorous life. In 1909, she staged a fake car crash by the sea after taking money from people who believed her story. Jean-Claude Roman smiles in a family photo that hid one of France's most shocking false identities. He pretended to be a World Health Organization doctor for 18 years. And when the lie collapsed in January 1993, his wife, 2 children, and 2 parents died. Jewish World War I veteran Richard Stern stands at his cologne shop in 1933 with his Iron Cross on his chest while a Nazi guard blocks customers outside. He fled Germany in 1939 and joined the United States Army in 1942 at age 43. These Sioux children were photographed before entering school at the start of a system that tried to replace native language and culture. The United States ran indigenous boarding schools from 1819 to 1969, and more than 500 schools were part of that system. Dr. Jesse William Lazier helped prove that mosquitoes spread yellow fever by turning his own body into the test. In 1900, he let an infected mosquito bite him, became ill, and died 17 days later. McMartin Preschool became the center of one of the strangest legal scandals in American history, turning an ordinary school into a national obsession. The case began in 1983, lasted 7 years, cost about $15 million, and ended with no convictions. Jerome of Sandy Cove became one of Canada's strangest human mysteries after he appeared from nowhere and never explained who he was. He washed ashore in Nova Scotia in 1863 without both legs, and his name and origin were never confirmed. 3 generations of one family lived at 27 Bayard Street, and the family also owned a saloon at number 20 on the same block. This part of Bayard Street was later cleared for the Manhattan Bridge and Confucius Plaza. One of the last known photos of Andre the Giant shows him in Paris, far from the ring and just days from the end of his life. It was taken during his visit for his father's funeral, and he died in his sleep in Paris on January 27, 1993, at age 46. A former prisoner drags a camp guard by the hair in one of the rawest images made just after Dora Mittelbau was opened. United States troops reached Dora Mittelbau in April 1945, where more than 60,000 prisoners had been held. A liberated Dachau prisoner confronts a camp guard with a shovel in one of the most shocking images from the camp's final hours. United States forces reached Dachau on April 29, 1945, and more than 200,000 prisoners had passed through the camp system. The Undertaker stands over the ring after one of wrestling's most unforgettable, unscripted moments, with mankind down below after crashing through the cage roof. The fall happened on June 28, 1998, at King of the Ring. A 1980 arrest in Japan turned a global music icon into front-page news almost overnight. He was detained in Tokyo in January 1980, spent 10 days in jail, and was then deported from Japan. Turkey's prime minister is on the ground just seconds after a horse ride turned into a public mishap. The fall happened in Istanbul in 2003 when Recep Tayyip Erdogan was opening a park as prime minister. A bare quarry outside Paris carried the strange name American Quarries, and local legend later tied it to the Statue of Liberty. This photo is dated 1878, and the statue was unveiled in New York in 1886. Lufthansa turned some flights into a flying beer hall, serving draft beer from a keg right in the aisle. This onboard service appeared on Lufthansa flights in the 1960s. Ken McElroy's truck became part of one of America's strangest small-town mysteries after he collapsed in broad daylight. He died in Skidmore, Missouri on July 10, 1981, and no one was ever charged, even though more than 40 people were nearby. Rocky Dennis sits beside his mother in a rare photo tied to one of the most unforgettable true stories of the 1970s. Born in 1961, he lived with craniodiaphyseal dysplasia and died in 1978 at age 16. An underwater wedding in Texas turned a normal ceremony into a scene that still looks unreal. This photo was taken in 1954 at the Marine Theater in San Marcos, Texas. 17-year-old Franca Viola became the first woman in Italy to refuse a forced, rehabilitating marriage after being abducted and attacked in 1966. Her decision shocked the country, and Italy abolished that legal custom in 1981. A San Francisco court moved outside in 1918, turning a legal hearing into an open-air health measure. It happened during the influenza pandemic when officials used fresh air and distance to lower the risk of infection. A woman from Bonnie and Clyde's gang is seized in a field in one of the last real images from their final chapter. Blanche Barrow was captured in August 1933 at just 81 pounds, and she later became the only gang member to survive into old age, dying in 1988. Three men stand close against a bare East Berlin wall, turning an empty street into a secret marketplace. Ralph Crane took this photo in 1953 when illegal currency exchange was common in divided Berlin. Adolf Hitler is shown visiting a World War I trench linked to his earlier service, creating a rare image where two wars seem to meet in one frame. The visit was photographed at Fromelles in northern France in 1940, more than 20 years after his service on the Western Front in World War I. At the first Oscars in 1929, Janet Gaynor received the Best Actress award in a moment that helped launch Hollywood's biggest tradition. The first Academy Awards took place on May 16, 1929, and Gaynor won for three films: Seventh Heaven, Street Angel, and Sunrise. A Galveston house sits twisted almost onto one corner after the 1900 storm, making the street look unreal. The hurricane hit in 1900, and storm surge moved buildings across the city, including this house on Avenue. Fiorenzo Magni is gripping a tube with his teeth here because it let him control the bike after two brutal crashes in the 1956 Giro d'Italia. He broke his left collarbone on stage 12, later broke his left upper arm, finished all 23 stages, and placed second by 3 minutes, 27 seconds. A 1923 Christmas celebration in Badagry turned into a striking group portrait with Badagry Merry Xmas painted across the men's chests. The photo was taken in Badagry near Lagos, one of the oldest coastal towns in present-day Nigeria. Joe looks almost unreal beside the child, with one dinner table showing the full scale of his size. This photo was taken in 1931 and shows Joe, then described as one of the heaviest men in the world. A British couple pose with two pairs of twins, turning one family portrait into a rare 1860s wonder. The photo was taken in Britain in the 1860s and shows the parents holding all four babies at once. French sailors pose on the wreck of German submarine UC-61 near Wissant, and the torn hull still looks unreal on the shore. UC-61 ran aground on the French coast in July 1917, and this photo was taken in August 1917. A taxi door marked "Colored Only" turned an ordinary cab into a blunt record of segregation in daily life. The photo dates to the early 1960s, when racial segregation still shaped transport and public life in parts of the United States. From above, the Cuyahoga looks red and poisoned, turning one American river into a warning sign. This 1967 aerial photo captured industrial waste flowing into the Cuyahoga in Ohio, 2 years before the river's most famous fire in 1969. Men balance high on power lines in a scene that makes early city work look almost impossible. The image is dated to the 1910s in the United States, when line workers often worked without modern harness systems or insulated bucket trucks. A Pulitzer Prize-winning photo froze a real 1977 hostage scene in Indiana, with Tony Kuritzis holding mortgage broker Richard Hall at gunpoint. The image was taken in 1977 and later won the Pulitzer Prize. Betty Ford dances on a White House table on her last day as First Lady, turning one of America's most formal rooms into a rare, carefree scene. Gerald Ford left office on January 20, 1977, after losing the 1976 election. Fyodor Makhnov stands in a Paris shop doorway and makes everyone around him look child-sized. He was reported at 2.39 meters and became one of the most famous giants of his era. A room packed with Finnish Santas in 1920 looks so strange it almost feels staged. This photo was taken in Finland in 1920 and shows men dressed as Joulupukki, the Finnish Santa figure. Women sit behind bars in a Japanese brothel house in a system that turned people into a public display. The photo is dated 1890, when licensed red light districts were still legal in Japan. Otto Skorzeny sits in uniform before becoming one of the most famous special operations officers of World War II. Born on June 12, 1908, the Austrian officer later led the 1943 raid that freed Benito Mussolini from captivity. Children stand beneath a giant "God Save America from Communism" banner, showing how Cold War fear reached even public events with families. The photo was taken in Boston in 1950 as anti-communist politics spread across the United States. Yugoslav partisan girls walked toward the camera with rifles, showing how young women stood on the front line of one of Europe's strongest resistance movements. The photo was taken before the 1944 fight for Belgrade, when Yugoslav partisans, a helicopter rising above the crowd, captured the moment Nicolae Ceausescu tried to escape as his rule collapsed in Bucharest. He and Elena Ceausescu left the Communist Party headquarters by helicopter on December 22, 1989, during the Romanian Revolution. Topsider Station looks ripped open here, with track after track twisted across Belgrade. The photo was taken on October 12, 1944, and shows railway lines destroyed by retreating German forces at Topsider Station. Lancashire factory workers rest on fresh mattresses in a scene that looks normal until you learn what filled them. The photo was taken in 1918, and the mattresses were made with asbestos, a material then widely used before its health risks were widely recognized. 10 faces on one board turned the 1981 Irish hunger strike into one of the most powerful prison protests in modern Europe. Bobby Sands died on May 5, 1981, and 9 more men died between May and August 1981 during the protest in Northern Ireland. Aircraft carrier Soryu sits at Kure during fitting out, before becoming one of the most important warships in Japan's Navy. This photo was taken in early 1937, and Soryu was later sunk at Midway in June 1942. Anna Nicole Smith was 26 when she married 89-year-old billionaire J. Howard Marshall in 1994, creating one of the most talked-about celebrity marriages of the decade. He died in 1995, and years of court fights over his $1.6 billion estate followed without making her an heir. The first Chernobyl sarcophagus wrapped Reactor 4 in a rushed shell of steel and concrete, making this one of the most chilling construction photos ever taken. It was completed in November 1986 near Pripyat, only months after the April 26, 1986 reactor accident. I will be very grateful for your subscription to the channel. Every day I try to tell you about such interesting historical photos.